Good evening, all, and welcome back to Farcical Fears. Imagine being trapped in the back seat as your driver locks the doors and ignores the GPS, steering you deep into an abandoned factory in the middle of the night. Tonight, you'll hear true stories of passengers who vanished without a trace, ghostly riders who were never really there, chilling knocks echoing from a trunk, stalkers who turned routine rides into nightmares, and drivers who never made it home after their final fare. From fake Ubers that led to tragedy to cars that seemed to drive themselves. These are 10 horrifying tales of rides that should never have been taken. These passengers and drivers wish they had never stepped inside those cars. And after this, you just might think twice before booking your next ride. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to Farcical Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Story 1. The Passenger Who Never Existed. Marcus Chen stared at the empty back seat through his rearview mirror, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. The door was still ajar, swaying gently in the cold October wind. But the woman he'd just driven for 20 minutes across downtown Seattle was gone, vanished, like she'd never been there at all. But what happened next changed everything. It started 3 hours earlier when Marcus accepted a late-night pickup request at 11:47 p.m. The app showed a 5-star passenger named Elena requesting a ride from Pike Place Market to an address in Capitol Hill. Simple enough. He'd done hundreds of these rides. When he pulled up to the dimly lit corner, a woman in her mid-30s wearing a gray coat stepped into his back seat without a word. Her face was pale, almost ghostly in the streetlight's glow, but Marcus chalked it up to exhaustion. She was probably just tired. Marcus glanced at her through the mirror and asked if she was heading to Capitol Hill. She nodded slowly, but didn't speak. The silence stretched uncomfortably as he merged onto the empty streets. Every few minutes, he'd try to make small talk, asking about her night, the weather, anything to break the eerie quiet. But Elena just stared out the window, her expression blank, her breathing so shallow he could barely hear it. Something felt wrong, but Marcus couldn't put his finger on it. The city lights reflected off her pale skin as they passed through downtown, and Marcus noticed she hadn't blinked once since getting in the car. Then came the moment that made his blood run cold. As they approached a red light near Broadway, Marcus glanced at the rearview mirror again and saw her staring directly at him. Not just looking, staring with wide, unblinking eyes that seemed to pierce straight through him. Her pupils were dilated, black and endless, and her mouth was slightly open as if she were about to speak but couldn't find the words. Marcus felt a chill crawl down his spine and asked nervously if she was okay. She didn't respond. She just kept staring, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. But what happened next changed everything. The light turned green, and Marcus accelerated, his heart pounding against his ribcage. He tried to focus on the road, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly off about this woman. Her silence wasn't normal. Her stillness wasn't natural. It was like she wasn't really there, like she was some kind of projection or hologram that had somehow manifested in his back seat. When he finally pulled up to the destination, a quiet residential street lined with dark houses, he turned around to tell her they'd arrived. The back seat was empty, completely empty. The door was still closed and locked from the inside. Marcus's stomach dropped like a stone. He threw the car into park and jumped out, checking every angle of the vehicle. No one. The street was deserted. No pedestrians, no other cars, no sound except the distant hum of traffic from the main road. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out with shaking hands. A notification from the app. Trip completed. Passenger rated you 5 stars. Marcus felt the hairs on his neck stand up. How could she rate him if she was gone? How could she rate him if she'd never existed? He immediately called Uber support, his voice shaking as he explained what happened. The representative sounded confused, but pulled up the trip details. Marcus waited, his heart hammering, expecting some kind of explanation. Maybe she'd gotten out at a red light, maybe there was a glitch, anything that made sense. But the rep's response made his blood freeze. "Sir, according to our records, you completed the trip alone. There's no passenger listed for this ride." Marcus insisted he'd picked someone up, that she was in his car for 20 minutes, that he'd watched her in the mirror the entire time. But the rep repeated the same thing. No passenger, no fare, nothing. Just Marcus driving alone through Seattle. Desperate for answers, Marcus checked his dash cam footage. Surely it would show her getting in, sitting there, staring at him with those empty eyes. He scrolled to the timestamp when he picked her up at Pike Place Market, his fingers fumbling over his phone screen. The footage loaded slowly, and Marcus held his breath. It showed his car pulling up to the corner at exactly 11:47 p.m. The back door opened, he could see it clearly swinging outward, and then it closed by itself. No woman, no gray coat, no Elena. The entire 20-minute drive showed an empty back seat. Marcus rewound it, played it again, zoomed in on every frame. Nothing. No woman. No shadow. No reflection. Just him driving alone through the city, talking to thin air, glancing at an empty seat in his rearview mirror like a man losing his mind. But what happened next changed everything. Marcus couldn't let it go. He started digging online, searching for similar stories, desperate to prove he wasn't crazy. That's when he found them. Dozens of reports from Uber and taxi drivers across the country who claimed to have picked up passengers who vanished mid-ride or were never captured on camera. In Seattle alone, there were at least 7 documented cases in the past 2 years of drivers reporting ghost passengers near Pike Place Market. All of them described the same thing. A woman in a gray coat, silent as death, staring with empty eyes, and then gone without a trace, as if she'd never existed. One forum post made Marcus's hands go numb. It was from a driver named Rick who'd had the exact same experience 3 months earlier. Rick wrote, "I picked her up at Pike Place at 11:45 p.m. She never spoke, just stared. When I got to the destination, she was gone, vanished from a locked car. But here's the thing, I looked up the address afterward. It was a cemetery, Lakeview Cemetery. And the passenger's pickup location? The exact spot where a woman named Elena Vasquez died in a hit-and-run accident 5 years ago. She was walking home from work when a driver struck her and fled the scene. They never found who did it. But drivers keep reporting picking her up from that same corner, night after night, like she's still trying to get home." Marcus's entire body went cold as he read those words. He pulled up the address he'd just dropped Elena off at, the address the app had shown before it disappeared from his trip history. His screen loaded agonizingly slowly, each second stretching into eternity. When it finally appeared, Marcus felt like he couldn't breathe. It was Lakeview Cemetery, the exact same cemetery Rick had mentioned. He pulled up Street View and recognized the residential street immediately. The gates were just beyond where he'd stopped, hidden in the darkness. Elena hadn't been trying to get home. She'd been trying to get to her final resting place. Marcus sat in his car for hours that night, parked outside a 24-hour diner, too terrified to drive. He never took another late-night ride in that part of the city again. He changed his route preferences, declined any pickups near Pike Place Market after 10 p.m., and eventually stopped driving altogether. But every now and then, late at night when he can't sleep, he checks the Uber app. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, he sees a ride request pop up. The pickup location is always Pike Place Market. The destination is always Capitol Hill. And the passenger's name is always Elena. Marcus never accepts those rides. He just stares at the screen until the request times out and disappears into the digital void. Because he knows that some passengers aren't looking for a ride home. They're looking for something else entirely. And Marcus Chen learned the hard way that not everyone who gets into your car is actually alive. Story 2. The Wrong Destination. Jessica Tran's scream was swallowed by the roar of the engine as the car sped past the third exit she'd begged him to take. The driver, a man in his 40s with cold, emotionless eyes, had stopped responding to her pleas 5 minutes ago. The child locks were engaged. The windows wouldn't roll down. And the GPS on her phone showed they were heading deep into an industrial wasteland on the outskirts of Portland, miles away from her apartment. But what happened next changed everything. It started innocently enough. Jessica, a 26-year-old marketing assistant, had just finished drinks with friends in downtown Portland around 10 p.m. on a Friday night. She requested an Uber to take her home, a simple 12-minute ride to her apartment in the Pearl District. When the black sedan pulled up, she checked the license plate against the app. It matched. She climbed into the back seat, exhausted and ready to collapse into bed. The driver grunted a greeting but didn't make conversation. Jessica didn't think much of it at first. Some drivers just weren't chatty. She pulled out her phone and started scrolling through Instagram, barely paying attention to the route. The city lights blurred past her window as she relaxed into the seat, thinking about nothing except her comfortable bed waiting at home. But after a few minutes, something felt off. The streets didn't look familiar. They were supposed to be heading north toward her neighborhood, but the buildings outside were getting older, more industrial. Jessica looked up from her phone, her stomach tightening with the first flutter of unease. She leaned forward and said politely that she thought he'd missed the turn. The driver didn't respond. His eyes stayed fixed on the road, his jaw clenched tight. Jessica checked the GPS on her phone, and her stomach dropped like a stone. They were heading east, completely the wrong direction. She tried again, her voice firmer this time, telling him he was going the wrong way and needed to turn around now. But what happened next changed everything. The driver accelerated instead of slowing down, merging onto a dark highway that led away from the city. Jessica's heart began to pound in her chest. She raised her voice, demanding he stop the car immediately. The driver's knuckles turned white on the steering wheel, but he didn't even glance at her in the rearview mirror. It was like she didn't exist. Jessica reached for the door handle, panic rising in her throat, and pulled hard. Locked. She pressed the window button frantically. Nothing. The child locks were engaged. She was trapped in a moving car with a stranger who wouldn't acknowledge her existence, speeding toward God knows where. Terror flooded through her veins as she screamed at him to let her out, pounding on the window with her fists. Jessica's mind raced as the car sped deeper into an area she didn't recognize. Abandoned warehouses, empty lots, rusted metal fences stretching into the darkness. They were completely alone. No other cars, no pedestrians, no witnesses. She fumbled with her phone, her hands shaking so violently she could barely type. She managed to text her roommate, "Help!" Driver won't stop. Taking me somewhere. Call police. Her fingers were trembling so badly the message was barely coherent. But she hit send and prayed it would go through. The signal was weak this far from the city, and she watched the message sit there with a loading icon, unsure if it had been delivered. She tried to share her live location, but the app kept freezing. Time seemed to slow down as every second stretched into an eternity of pure terror. The driver finally spoke, his voice low and chilling, cutting through the silence like a blade. "You shouldn't have gotten in." Jessica's blood turned to ice. Those 5 words confirmed her worst nightmare. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a wrong turn. This was intentional. She looked around desperately for anything she could use as a weapon. Her purse, her keys. She gripped her keys tightly in her fist, the sharp ends poking out between her fingers the way her father had taught her years ago. Her heart hammered against her ribcage so hard she thought it might explode. She kept her eyes on the driver's reflection in the rearview mirror, watching for any sudden movement, ready to fight for her life. But what happened next changed everything. The car finally slowed as they approached a desolate industrial complex surrounded by chain-link fencing and barbed wire. Graffiti covered the walls of abandoned buildings, and broken glass littered the cracked pavement. The driver pulled into an empty lot far from any main road and put the car in park. The engine idled quietly, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of Jessica's ragged breathing. She knew she had seconds, maybe less, to act. As the driver turned around to face her, his expression cold and predatory, Jessica didn't hesitate. She lunged forward with everything she had and jabbed the keys directly into his face, aiming for his eyes. The driver screamed, a guttural sound of pain and rage, covering his face with his hands. In that split second of chaos, Jessica heard the door locks disengage with a mechanical click. She threw the door open and ran. She didn't look back. She didn't stop. Her legs burned as she sprinted through the gravel lot toward the distant glow of streetlights, her lungs screaming for air. Behind her, she could hear the driver's car door slam and his heavy footsteps chasing her, his voice roaring with fury. But Jessica was faster. Adrenaline coursed through her body like electricity, pushing her beyond any limit she thought she had. She ran harder than she'd ever run in her life, her vision tunneling to focus only on that distant light, her only hope of survival. She could hear him getting closer, his breathing heavy and labored. But she pushed herself even harder, every muscle in her body, screaming. She spotted a 24-hour gas station in the distance, its fluorescent lights like a beacon of salvation, and she pushed herself to go faster. Her lungs felt like they were on fire, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. But she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when she was so close. She burst through the gas station doors, gasping and sobbing, her entire body shaking with shock and exhaustion. The clerk behind the counter jumped up, his eyes wide with alarm. Jessica choked out the words between sobs, begging him to call the police, telling him someone had tried to kidnap her. The clerk immediately dialed 911 while Jessica collapsed against the wall, sliding down to the floor as her legs finally gave out. Her hands were still clutching her keys so tightly, her knuckles had turned white. Within minutes, police arrived with sirens blaring and took her statement. They searched the surrounding area but found no trace of the driver or the vehicle. He'd vanished into the industrial maze, leaving behind only tire tracks and Jessica's terror. Officers tried to comfort her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders as she gave them every detail she could remember. His appearance, the car, the route, everything. But what happened next changed everything. When detectives investigated Jessica's Uber account the next day, they discovered something that made the case even more horrifying. The ride she thought she'd taken wasn't in her app history. There was no record of the trip, no driver profile, no license plate match in Uber's system. The car that picked her up wasn't her Uber at all. Investigators later revealed that the man had been using a fake Uber sticker and strategically positioning himself outside bars and clubs, preying on intoxicated passengers who didn't double-check their rides carefully enough. He'd been doing it for months, watching, waiting, selecting his victims with calculated precision. Jessica later learned through the investigation that she was the fourth woman to report a similar incident in Portland that year. 2 others had managed to escape like she did. But one, a 23-year-old college student, was still missing. Her case unsolved, her family still searching. The detective told Jessica quietly that her quick thinking and bravery had likely saved her life and possibly prevented more attacks. The man's pattern had been escalating, and Jessica had been lucky enough to fight back at the right moment. Jessica never took another rideshare alone at night again. The trauma of that night changed her forever. She now triple-checks the license plate, makes the driver confirm her name before she gets in, and always shares her live location with multiple friends before accepting any ride. She enrolled in self-defense classes and carries pepper spray everywhere she goes. But even now, years later, she still has nightmares about that industrial lot, that cold voice saying, "You shouldn't have gotten in," and the sound of footsteps chasing her through the darkness. She knows she survived when others didn't. And she knows that one small mistake, not verifying her ride carefully enough, almost cost her everything. Every time she tells her story, she ends with the same warning. Always check the license plate, always verify the driver's photo, and never, ever assume the car that pulls up is actually yours. Because sometimes the person behind the wheel isn't a driver at all. They're a predator, and you might not get a second chance to escape. Story 3. The body in the trunk. The banging started softly at first. Just a faint thud from the trunk that David Okonkwo thought was his loose spare tire rolling around. But then it got louder, harder, more desperate. And then came the muffled screaming. David slammed on the brakes in the middle of a dark Texas back road, his heart hammering in his chest. Someone was inside his trunk, and he had no idea how they got there. But what happened next changed everything. David, a 34-year-old Uber driver in Houston, had been working the night shift for almost 2 years. He'd seen it all: drunk passengers stumbling into his car at 3 a.m., couples arguing loudly in his back seat, people getting sick out the window. But nothing could have prepared him for this night. It was 2:15 a.m. on a Wednesday when he accepted a pickup request from 2 men outside a dive bar in Northeast Houston. They looked rough around the edges. One wore a stained hoodie with the hood pulled up. The other had a baseball cap yanked low over his face, shadowing his features. David hesitated for a moment, his instincts prickling with unease. But he needed the fare. Rent was due in 3 days, and he was still short. So he pulled up to the curb and unlocked the doors, watching in his rearview mirror as they approached. David asked where they were headed as they climbed into the back seat, trying to sound casual and friendly like he always did. The one in the hoodie mumbled an address on the outskirts of the city, some warehouse district David wasn't familiar with, far from the main roads and residential areas. The ride was supposed to take 20 minutes through increasingly empty streets. The men barely spoke during the drive, just whispered to each other in voices too low for David to hear. Every now and then, he'd catch fragments of their conversation. Words that didn't quite make sense, tones that sounded urgent and aggressive. Something felt off, deeply wrong. But David tried to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine like ice-cold fingers. He just wanted to drop them off and move on to the next ride, preferably something normal and uneventful. But what happened next changed everything. About halfway through the trip, David heard a strange noise from the back of the car. It sounded like something heavy shifting in the trunk, a muffled thump that made his stomach clench. He glanced at the rearview mirror, studying the two men's faces. They were sitting perfectly still, staring straight ahead with blank expressions, their bodies rigid. David cleared his throat nervously and asked if they heard that noise. Neither of them responded. They didn't even blink. The noise came again, louder this time, more insistent. A definite thud, followed by what sounded like muffled movement, like someone trying to shift position in a confined space. David's hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. David's stomach tightened with dread as he asked directly if they had put something in his trunk. The man in the hoodie finally turned to look at him, and David felt a chill run through his entire body. The man's eyes were cold and hard, devoid of any human warmth or emotion. His voice was flat when he spoke. "Just drive." David's mouth went dry. He tried again, his voice shaking now, demanding to know what was in his trunk. The second man leaned forward, close enough that David could smell cigarette smoke and alcohol on his breath. His voice was low and threatening, cutting through the tension like a knife. "I said drive. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The implied threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Panic surged through David's body like an electrical current. He knew something was horribly, terribly wrong. His mind raced as he tried to figure out what to do, what his options were. They were on a deserted road with no other cars in sight, just empty fields and darkness stretching in every direction. If he stopped the car, would they hurt him? Would they kill him? If he kept driving, where were they taking him? What were they planning to do? The banging from the trunk grew louder, more frantic, more desperate. And then he heard it. A voice. Faint, muffled by metal and distance, but unmistakably human. Someone was screaming inside his trunk, their cries weak and terrified, begging for help that might never come. But what happened next changed everything. David's blood ran cold as he realized with sickening clarity what was happening. These men had put someone in his trunk while he wasn't looking, probably when he'd stepped away to use the restroom at the gas station before picking them up. He'd left his car unlocked for maybe 2 minutes, just long enough. They'd used his car to transport a victim, making him an unwitting accomplice to God knows what. Kidnapping, assault, maybe worse. David's hands began to shake on the steering wheel as the full horror of the situation crashed over him. He had to do something. He couldn't let this continue. Someone's life depended on his next decision, and he had seconds to make it. David made a split-second decision that would either save a life or cost him his own. Without warning, he yanked the steering wheel hard to the right and slammed on the brakes with all his strength, sending the car skidding violently off the road into a shallow ditch. The two men were thrown forward against their seatbelts, cursing and yelling in surprise and rage. David didn't wait to see what they would do. He threw the car into park, ripped the keys from the ignition, and bolted from the driver's seat. His legs pumped as fast as they could carry him, his lungs burning as he ran toward the nearest house he could see, a small farmhouse about 100 yards away, with a single porch light glowing like a beacon in the darkness. Behind him, David could hear the car doors opening and the men shouting, their voices filled with fury and panic. But David didn't look back. He couldn't. Looking back meant slowing down, and slowing down meant dying. He He ran harder than he'd ever run in his life, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might explode. He reached the farmhouse and pounded on the door with his fists, screaming for help at the top of his lungs. An older man in his 70s opened the door, shocked and confused, his weathered face creased with concern. David gasped out the words, barely able to form coherent sentences. "Call 911. There's someone in my trunk. Call the police now, please." The man immediately grabbed his phone and dialed as David collapsed on the porch steps, his entire body shaking with shock and adrenaline. Within minutes, police arrived with sirens wailing and surrounded David's car with weapons drawn. The two men were long gone. They'd fled into the woods the moment David ran, disappearing into the darkness like the predators they were. Officers approached the trunk cautiously, not knowing what they'd find, their hands on their weapons. When they popped it open, they found a young woman in her early 20s bound with duct tape, her wrists and ankles secured, a piece of cloth stuffed in her mouth as a gag. She was barely conscious, her face bruised and swollen, her eyes unfocused and filled with terror. Paramedics rushed her to the hospital where she eventually recovered, though she had little memory of what happened due to trauma and possible drugging. She'd been abducted from a parking lot earlier that night, while walking to her car after her shift at a restaurant. But what happened next changed everything. Police traced the two men using surveillance footage from the bar and the gas station, where they'd loaded the victim into David's trunk. Both were wanted in connection with multiple kidnappings across Texas and Louisiana, part of a larger trafficking operation that had been operating for years. They'd been using rideshare drivers as unwitting accomplices, loading victims into trunks while drivers were distracted or away from their vehicles. David's quick thinking and bravery had saved the woman's life and broken open an investigation that led to the arrest of 7 more people involved in the operation. Detectives told him he was a hero, that his actions had prevented countless more abductions. But David didn't feel like a hero. The trauma of that night never left him. He quit driving for Uber the next day and couldn't bring himself to open his trunk for months without his hands shaking and his heart racing. Every time he heard a noise from the back of any car, he'd freeze, transported back to that dark Texas back road and the sound of desperate screaming. He started having nightmares, vivid, terrifying dreams, where he kept driving, where he didn't stop, where the woman in his trunk died because he was too afraid to act. He went to therapy, but some wounds run too deep to heal completely. David eventually found a different job, something that kept him away from cars and strangers and the darkness of late-night shifts. But he'll never forget the sound of that muffled screaming, and he'll never forget the choice he made that saved a life. Because sometimes doing the right thing means risking everything. And that night, David Okonkwo risked it all. Story 4. Midnight Stalker Passenger. Vanessa Reyes knew something was wrong the third time she saw him. The same man, the same destination, the same unnerving smile that never quite reached his eyes. He'd requested her specifically through Uber's driver preference feature 3 nights in a row now, and each ride had grown progressively more disturbing. Tonight, the 4th night, he'd asked her to pull into a dark alley behind an abandoned strip mall in Phoenix. And when she refused, he'd locked his hand around her wrist and whispered with chilling calmness, "I've been waiting for you." But what happened next changed everything. It started innocently enough. Vanessa, a 29-year-old single mother working night shifts to make ends meet, had been driving for Uber for 8 months. She prided herself on maintaining a perfect 5-star rating and always being professional with passengers, treating each ride like it mattered because it did. Every fare brought her closer to paying her daughter's daycare bills and keeping food on the table. On Monday night, she picked up a man named Trevor, from a downtown office building around 11 p.m. He was in his late 30s, well-dressed in a tailored suit and tie, and polite enough when he greeted her. He requested a ride to a residential neighborhood about 15 minutes away, nothing unusual about the trip at all. During the ride, Trevor made small talk in a friendly voice, asking about her night, how long she'd been driving, whether she enjoyed the work. Vanessa answered politely, but kept the conversation surface level, sharing just enough to be cordial without crossing any boundaries. She'd learned early on in this job not to share too much personal information with passengers. You never knew who was listening a little too carefully, who was filing away details for reasons you didn't want to think about. When they arrived at his destination, Trevor thanked her warmly, gave her a $5 tip through the app, and left. Vanessa thought nothing of it. Just another ride. Just another passenger in the endless stream of faces that passed through her car every night. But what happened next changed everything. The next night, Tuesday, Vanessa received another ride request around the same time, just after 11 p.m. when the downtown bars were starting to empty. When she accepted it and saw the passenger's name, her stomach did a small flip. It was Trevor again. Same pickup location outside the same office building, same destination in that quiet residential neighborhood. That was odd, certainly, but not completely unheard of. Maybe he worked late shifts and lived nearby. Maybe he was a regular commuter who preferred Uber to driving. When she picked him up, Trevor smiled widely, his teeth very white in the glow of the streetlights, and said with obvious pleasure, "Hey, I was hoping I'd get you again." Vanessa forced a smile back, but she felt a small twinge of unease prickle at the back of her neck. This time, Trevor's questions became more personal, crossing invisible lines that made Vanessa increasingly uncomfortable. He asked where she lived, whether she had kids, what her schedule was like. Questions that felt like they were probing for information rather than making conversation. Vanessa deflected skillfully, keeping her answers deliberately vague and non-committal. "Oh, I live around the area. My schedule varies quite a bit." But Trevor pressed further, his tone becoming more insistent. "Do you always work this late? I'd feel safer knowing you're the one picking me up. It's nice to have a familiar face, you know." Vanessa's unease grew with each question, but she tried to stay professional, reminding herself that she needed this job, needed these fares. When they arrived at his house, Trevor lingered before getting out, his hand resting on the door handle. "See you tomorrow night," he said with that same wide grin. Vanessa didn't respond, just nodded politely and waited for him to leave. Wednesday night came, and Vanessa seriously considered declining any rides from that area. Her instincts were screaming at her that something wasn't right about Trevor, that his behavior was escalating in ways that made her skin crawl. But she needed the money desperately. Her daughter's daycare bill was due, and she couldn't afford to be picky about which rides she accepted. Sure enough, at 11:03 p.m., a ride request popped up on her phone. Trevor. Again, for the third night in a row. This time, Vanessa's instincts screamed at her to decline, to block this passenger and move on. But she hesitated. Canceling too many rides could hurt her rating, could affect her ability to get rides in the future, could cost her this job she desperately needed. Against her better judgment, against every alarm bell ringing in her head, she accepted the ride. But what happened next changed everything. When Trevor got into the car that third night, his demeanor had shifted dramatically. He was no longer polite and chatty and friendly. He was quiet, intense, his body language completely different. He stared at her through the rearview mirror with an unsettling focus that made her feel like prey being watched by a predator. You look tired tonight, he said slowly, drawing out each word. Vanessa's hands tightened on the wheel, her knuckles going white. I'm fine. Just a long day. Trevor leaned forward, closer than passengers should ever lean, invading the invisible boundary between front and back seat. You work too hard? You should let me take care of you. The words hung in the air, inappropriate and threatening. Vanessa's heart pounded as she told him firmly to sit back. But Trevor didn't move. Instead, he smiled. A smile that made her skin crawl, that had nothing warm or friendly about it. I've been watching you, Vanessa. I know your route. I know when you work. I know where you go after your shifts end. Vanessa's blood turned to ice. How did he know her name? It wasn't displayed in the app for passengers. They only saw her first initial. And how did he know her route, her schedule, where she went after work? Had he been following her? Watching her? The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't coincidence. This was stalking. This was predatory behavior. And she was alone with him in a car in the middle of the night. As they approached Trevor's usual destination, he suddenly leaned forward even closer, and his voice changed, becoming commanding and cold. Actually, change of plans. Pull into that alley up ahead. He pointed to a dark, narrow alley behind an abandoned strip mall, a place where no one would see, no one would hear, no one would help. Vanessa's instincts took over completely. No, I'm taking you to your original destination. Her voice was steady despite her terror. Trevor's voice turned ice cold, all pretense of friendliness gone. I said pull into the alley. Vanessa refused, keeping her eyes locked on the road ahead, her hands gripping the wheel so tight her fingers ached. Sir, if you don't want to go to your destination, I'm ending this ride right now. That's when Trevor lunged forward and grabbed her wrist with crushing force, his fingers digging into her skin, hard enough to leave bruises. You're not ending anything, he hissed, his face close enough that she could feel his breath on her neck. Vanessa screamed and swerved the car violently, trying to shake him off, her training and instincts kicking in. She slammed on the brakes in the middle of the street and threw the car into park, not caring about traffic or anything except getting away from him. Get out! Get out now! She yelled at the top of her lungs. But Trevor didn't let go. Instead, he reached for the door handle with his free hand, trying to lock it from the inside, trying to trap her. Vanessa acted on pure adrenaline and survival instinct. She grabbed her phone and hit the emergency button on the Uber app, which immediately connected her to 911. Help! I'm being attacked by a passenger. I'm at the corner of... Before she could finish giving her location, Trevor released her wrist and threw the door open, stumbling out of the car. His face was twisted with rage and something darker, more dangerous. You're going to regret this. He spat venomously before disappearing into the shadows between buildings. Vanessa's entire body was shaking violently as the 911 operator stayed on the line, her calm voice talking Vanessa through the panic, dispatching police to her location. Within minutes, officers arrived with flashing lights and took her statement, examining the red marks already forming bruises on her wrist. But what happened next changed everything. When police ran Trevor's name through their system, they discovered he had a disturbing history. A restraining order from 2 years ago, filed by another woman he'd stalked relentlessly for months. He'd been arrested once for following a female coworker home from work and sitting outside her house for hours. There were multiple complaints filed against him by different women, a pattern of escalating predatory behavior. Detectives immediately began investigating whether he'd been targeting other female Uber drivers, And what they found was chilling. They discovered evidence that Trevor had created multiple Uber accounts under different names to bypass driver blocks, and had been systematically requesting the same women drivers for weeks or even months, learning their patterns, their schedules, their routes. He was hunting them methodically, patiently, waiting for the right moment. Vanessa never drove for Uber again after that night. The company banned Trevor from the platform permanently. But Vanessa couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there somewhere, watching, waiting, planning his next move. She installed security cameras around her home, changed her daily routines completely, took different routes to work, and enrolled in self-defense classes. Every time her phone buzzes late at night, her heart still races and her hands still shake. She checks her locks obsessively, looks over her shoulder constantly, and never feels quite safe anymore. Because she knows Trevor wasn't just a passenger who crossed a line. He was a predator who had been stalking her, learning her patterns, waiting for his opportunity to strike. And she was the one who got away. But she knows others might not be so lucky. She knows he's probably still out there, creating new accounts, finding new victims, perfecting his hunting techniques. And that knowledge haunts her every single day. Story 5. Silence on Highway 16. The hitchhiker was gone. Just gone. 1 second she was sitting in the back seat of Caleb Turner's truck, staring blankly out the window into the endless darkness. And the next, when he glanced back after hearing a strange creak, the seat was empty. The door was still locked. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, empty and dark. And Caleb was alone. Completely, impossibly alone. But what happened next changed everything. Caleb had been driving a private cab service along Highway 16 in British Columbia for 6 years. Locals called it the Highway of Tears, a desolate stretch of road where dozens of women had disappeared over the decades, most of them indigenous, their cases unsolved, and their families still searching for answers. Caleb knew the stories. Everyone who drove this route did. But he'd never believed in the supernatural explanations that people whispered about in gas stations and diners along the highway. Missing people had logical causes. Crime, bad luck, wrong place at the wrong time. He was practical, grounded. Until the night he picked up the woman in the red jacket. It was just past midnight on a freezing November night when Caleb spotted her standing on the side of the highway, thumb out, illuminated by his headlights, like a figure in a nightmare. She wore a bright red jacket, the kind hunters wore to stay visible in the woods, and her long black hair hung loose around her face, moving slightly in the wind. She stood perfectly still, not waving, not moving, not trying to flag him down more insistently like most hitchhikers would. Just waiting. Caleb slowed down, debating whether to stop. Picking up hitchhikers was risky, especially out here in the middle of nowhere at midnight. But something about her stillness, her vulnerability standing alone in the bitter cold, made him pull over onto the gravel shoulder. Caleb rolled down his window and called out, asking where she was headed. The woman didn't speak. She didn't even acknowledge that he'd asked a question. She just walked forward and opened the back door, climbing in without a word. Caleb waited for her to say something, anything, a destination, a greeting, a thank you. But she remained completely silent, staring out the window into the darkness of the surrounding forest. I need to know where you're going, Caleb said, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. Still nothing. Just that blank, empty stare fixed on the window. Caleb felt a chill run down his spine, but he chalked it up to the cold night air seeping through the open door. All right, well, I'm heading toward Prince George. drop you off wherever you need along the way. But what happened next changed everything. The woman didn't respond, but Caleb took her silence as agreement. He pulled back onto the highway and drove, the hum of the engine the only sound breaking the eerie quiet. Every few minutes, Caleb glanced at her in the mirror, trying to gauge if she was okay, if she needed anything. She hadn't moved, hadn't shifted position, hadn't blinked, just kept staring out into the black void of the forest, her face expressionless and pale as death. "You okay back there?" Caleb asked nervously, his voice sounding too loud in the oppressive silence. No response. His unease grew with every passing mile, every stretch of empty highway, every moment that she just sat there like a statue. About 20 minutes into the drive, Caleb heard a soft creak, like the sound of weight shifting on old leather seats. He glanced in the rearview mirror out of habit. The back seat was empty, completely empty. Caleb's heart stopped. He whipped his head around to look directly at the seat, his eyes scanning desperately. Nothing. No woman. No red jacket. No long black hair. Just an empty seat and a closed, locked door. "What the hell?" Caleb muttered, his voice shaking. He pulled over immediately, his hands trembling as he threw the truck into park. He jumped out into the freezing night air and circled the vehicle frantically, checking every door, every window. All locked, every single one. No signs of anyone getting out. No footprints in the gravel on the shoulder, no disturbance in the frost forming on the ground. Caleb opened the back door and stared at the empty seat, his mind racing, trying to make sense of what was impossible. This wasn't possible. She couldn't have just vanished into thin air. People don't disappear from locked vehicles. He searched the surrounding area with his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, calling out into the dark forest. "Hello? Are you out there? Miss?" Nothing. Just the wind, whistling through the trees, like whispered warnings, and the distant howl of a coyote echoing across the empty landscape. Caleb climbed back into his truck, his hands trembling uncontrollably on the steering wheel. He didn't believe in ghosts. He didn't believe in curses or supernatural phenomena or any of that nonsense. But he couldn't explain what had just happened. She was there, and then she wasn't. Just gone. Vanished. He drove straight to the nearest gas station, a small rundown place about 15 miles up the highway, and practically ran inside. The attendant, an older man with weathered features, looked up from his magazine. Caleb asked breathlessly if anyone had reported a missing woman in a red jacket, if there had been any accidents nearby, anything that could explain what he'd just experienced. But what happened next changed everything. The attendant gave him a strange look, an expression that was part knowing and part pitying. "You mean the woman from '09? Caleb froze, his blood running cold. "What?" The attendant reached under the counter and pulled out an old newspaper clipping that had been taped to the wall behind him, yellowed with age and creased from being handled. It showed a photo of a young indigenous woman in a red jacket, her smile bright and full of life. The headline read in bold black letters, "Local woman vanishes on Highway 16. Search continues." The article was dated October 2009, 16 years ago. Caleb stared at the photo, his mind refusing to accept what he was seeing. That was her. That was the woman who'd been in his truck. The attendant pointed to the photo with a gnarled finger. "That's Mary Kissoon. She went missing on this highway back in 2009, 23 years old. They never found her body, never found any trace of what happened to her. But drivers have been reporting seeing her for years now. Always the same story. She gets in the back seat, doesn't talk, doesn't move, and then disappears before they reach the next town. Some say she appears on foggy nights. Others claim she only shows up to drivers traveling alone. A few even said that if you stop for her, you'll be cursed to see her again and again until you leave this highway for good. The attendant's voice dropped to a whisper. She's looking for something. Or maybe she's trying to warn people. No one really knows. Caleb researched Highway 16 obsessively after that night, unable to let it go, unable to sleep without understanding. He found dozens of reports, spanning decades, of drivers encountering the same woman in the red jacket. Police reports, online forums, newspaper articles from different years, all telling variations of the same story. Some drivers said she appeared on foggy nights when visibility was low. Others claimed she only showed up to drivers traveling alone on the darkest stretches of highway. A few even said that if you stopped for her, you'd see her again and again, night after night, until you abandoned the route entirely. Local indigenous communities spoke of her as a spirit who couldn't rest, still searching for her way home after whatever terrible thing had happened to her on this cursed stretch of road. But what happened next changed everything. Caleb never drove Highway 16 after that night. He transferred his route to a different area, willing to take the pay cut rather than risk encountering her again. He refused to talk about what happened to anyone except his wife, who begged him to see a therapist. But every now and then, late at night when he's driving alone on empty roads far from Highway 16, he swears he sees a flash of red in his rearview mirror. Just a glimpse. Just enough to make his heart stop and his hands freeze on the wheel. And when he does, he doesn't look back. He doesn't slow down. He just keeps driving, foot pressing harder on the gas pedal, trying to outrun something that can't be outrun. Because Caleb knows now that some passengers aren't looking for a ride to somewhere. They're trapped between worlds, endlessly searching, endlessly waiting. And Highway 16 will never let Mary Kissoon go. Story 6. Locked inside. The child locks were on, and Alicia Monroe's fingers were bleeding from clawing at the window. She'd been screaming for 15 minutes, but the driver, stony-faced and silent, kept his eyes on the road, ignoring her pleas as he drove deeper into the woods outside Atlanta. Alicia's phone was dead. The door wouldn't budge, and she just realized, with sickening clarity, that this man had driven this exact route before, with other women, women who never made it home. But what happened next changed everything. It started with a simple mistake. Alicia, a 31-year-old architect, had been working late at her office downtown and requested an Uber around 9 p.m. to head home. She was exhausted, distracted, scrolling through work emails on her phone as she waited for the car to arrive. Her mind was still running through blueprints and client meetings, too preoccupied to pay proper attention. When a black SUV pulled up to the curb outside her building, she barely glanced at the license plate before climbing into the back seat. The driver didn't greet her. He just started driving the moment her door closed. Alicia didn't notice at first. She was too focused on her phone, typing out a response to her boss about tomorrow's presentation. But after a few minutes, something felt off. Something wasn't right. The route didn't look familiar. They should have been heading north toward her neighborhood in Buckhead, following the same path she took every night. But instead, they were going east, away from the city lights and into darker, less populated areas she didn't recognize. Alicia looked up from her phone, her stomach tightening with the first flutter of concern. "Excuse me. I think you're going the wrong way," she said, keeping her voice calm and polite. The driver didn't respond. She checked her phone. Her Uber app showed no active trip. The screen was blank where the route should have been displayed. Her blood ran cold as the realization hit her like a freight train. This wasn't her Uber. This wasn't her driver. She'd gotten into the wrong car. But what happened next changed everything. "Hey, stop the car. You're not my driver," Alicia yelled, panic rising in her chest like a tidal wave. She reached for the door handle and pulled hard. Locked. She tried the window button, jabbing it frantically. Nothing. The child locks were on. She was trapped. "Let me out. Stop the car right now." The driver's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, cold and emotionless like a shark's, devoid of any human warmth or empathy. He didn't say a word. He just kept driving, faster now, the trees outside becoming a dark blur as they left civilization behind. Alicia's mind raced as she tried to figure out what to do, how to survive this nightmare. Her phone was at 20% battery, and the signal was weak this far from the city. Just one flickering bar that kept disappearing. She tried calling 911, but the call wouldn't connect. The screen just showed calling, endlessly without connecting. She sent a frantic text to her husband with shaking hands. "Not in my Uber. Kidnapped. Call police." She didn't know if it went through. The message just sat there with a single gray check mark, not the double blue ones that meant delivered. The driver made a sharp turn onto a dirt road, the SUV bouncing violently over potholes and rocks. They were deep in the woods now, miles from civilization, miles from help. Alicia's survival instincts kicked in with crystal clarity. She couldn't wait for help that might never come. She had to act. She scanned the interior of the SUV frantically, looking for anything she could use as a weapon. Her eyes landed on her laptop bag on the seat beside her. Inside was a heavy metal water bottle, the insulated kind that weighed at least a pound when full. She quietly unzipped the bag, trying not to make any sound that would alert the driver, and gripped the bottle tightly in her sweating palm. The driver glanced at her in the mirror, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Don't even think about it," he said, the first words he'd spoken. His voice was low, threatening, sending ice through her veins. Alicia's heart pounded so hard she thought her ribs might crack, but she didn't let go of the bottle. "Who are you? What do you want?" Alicia demanded, trying to keep her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her. The driver smiled, a cold, predatory smile that made her stomach turn and her skin crawl. "You'll find out soon enough." That's when Alicia noticed something that made her blood freeze in her veins. On the dashboard, partially hidden under a pile of receipts and fast food wrappers, was a stack of photos. Women's photos, ID photos, driver's licenses. And on top of the stack was a photo of a woman Alicia recognized from the news, a woman named Sarah Chen, who'd gone missing 3 months ago after getting into a rideshare vehicle in Atlanta. Her face had been plastered across every news channel, her family pleading for information, police searching desperately for any leads. But what happened next changed everything. Alicia realized with horrifying clarity that this man was a serial predator. He'd been using fake Uber stickers and preying on women who didn't double-check their rides carefully enough. And she was next on his list. But Alicia wasn't going to let that happen. She wasn't going to become another photo in his collection, another missing person poster, another family destroyed. She gripped the water bottle tighter and waited for the right moment, her entire body coiled like a spring. The driver slowed down as they approached a clearing in the woods, a secluded area where no one would hear, no one would see, no one would help. He put the car in park and turned around to face her, his expression twisted with dark intent. "Get out," he ordered, reaching for her arm with rough, calloused hands. Alicia didn't hesitate. She swung the water bottle, with all her strength, all her rage, all her will to survive, smashing it into the side of his head. The impact made a sickening thud. The driver yelled in pain, clutching his face as blood began to pour from a gash near his temple. In that split second of chaos, Alicia heard the door locks disengage with a mechanical click. She threw the door open and ran. She didn't look back. She didn't stop. She didn't think. She just ran for her life. Her legs burned as she sprinted through the woods, branches scratching her face and arms, thorns tearing at her clothes. Behind her, she could hear the driver's footsteps crashing through the underbrush and his enraged shouting echoing through the trees. But adrenaline gave her strength she didn't know she had. Alicia ran blindly, her lungs screaming for air, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to get away, had to survive, had to make it out of these woods alive. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only minutes, she saw lights in the distance through the trees. A gas station. Salvation. She pushed herself harder, her body screaming in protest. Alicia burst through the tree line and into the parking lot, collapsing at the entrance of the gas station. She couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, could only gasp and sob as her body shook violently. A truck driver ran over, alarmed by her appearance, clothes torn, face scratched and bleeding, eyes wild with terror. "Call the police, please! He's still out there!" Alicia choked out between sobs. The truck driver immediately pulled out his phone and dialed 911 while helping her inside to safety. But what happened next changed everything. Police arrived within minutes and flooded the area, searching for the driver and the SUV with K9 units and helicopters. They found the vehicle abandoned deeper in the woods, driver's side door still open, engine still running. But the driver was gone, disappeared into the forest like a ghost. Inside the SUV, they discovered a horrifying collection that made even seasoned detectives feel sick. IDs, photos, personal items from at least 12 different women. Jewelry, phones, wallets, trophies from his victims. The SUV was linked to multiple unsolved disappearances across Georgia and neighboring states going back 5 years. Alicia's quick thinking and courage had not only saved her own life, but had blown open a case that had stumped investigators for years. The driver was eventually captured 2 weeks later trying to cross the state line into Alabama. Traffic cameras had caught his face at a toll booth, and police moved in immediately. He was charged with kidnapping, attempted murder, and multiple counts of homicide. DNA evidence linked him to at least 8 murders. Alicia testified against him in court, her voice steady and strong despite the trauma that still haunted her nights. She refused to let fear control her life, refused to let him win even after everything he'd done. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before convicting him on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even now, years later, Alicia never gets into a rideshare without triple-checking everything. She verifies the license plate against the app 3 times. She checks the driver's photo and makes them confirm her name before she opens the door. She shares her live location with her husband, her best friend, and her sister every single time. She carries pepper spray in her purse and keeps her phone charged at all times, because she knows firsthand that not every ride is safe. She knows that a single moment of distraction, one small mistake, can cost you everything. And she knows that she was one of the lucky ones. She survived when others didn't. But survival came with a price. The constant vigilance, the nightmares, the hyper-awareness that never quite fades. Alicia lives with that price every day, but she lives. And that's what matters most. Story 7. ride into nowhere. When Connor Hayes opened his eyes, the first thing he noticed was that the driver's seat was empty. Completely empty. But the car was still moving, accelerating actually, down a pitch-black highway at 70 miles per hour. Connor's hands shot to the back door handle, but the locks were engaged. He was trapped in a driverless car hurtling into the void. And the dash cam, later reviewed by police, would show something that defied all logic. A shadowy figure in the front seat where no one should have been. But what happened next changed everything. Connor, a 28-year-old software engineer in Portland, had made a terrible decision that Friday night. After celebrating a friend's birthday at a downtown bar, he'd had way too much to drink, far more than he should have. His judgment was impaired, his coordination off, his decision-making compromised. Instead of calling a friend or waiting in the bar to sober up like he should have, he requested an Uber around 1:30 a.m. He barely remembered getting into the car. The driver, a middle-aged man with a quiet demeanor and kind eyes, had helped him into the back seat, even buckling his seatbelt for him. Connor mumbled his address through the fog of alcohol and immediately passed out, his head lolling against the window, consciousness slipping away into darkness. When Connor woke up, his head was pounding like someone was taking a sledgehammer to his skull, and his mouth felt like he'd been chewing on cotton. He blinked groggily, trying to orient himself, trying to remember where he was. The car was still moving, the steady hum of the engine vibrating through his bones. He assumed they were almost at his apartment, that he'd wake up in his own bed soon enough. But when he looked out the window, nothing looked familiar. They were on a dark, empty highway surrounded by dense forest on both sides. No streetlights, no other cars, no buildings or signs of civilization. Just endless darkness stretching in every direction like they'd driven off the edge of the world. "Hey, where are we?" Connor mumbled, his voice thick and slurred. No response. He blinked again, trying to focus through the alcohol still clouding his system. "Driver? Hello?" But what happened next changed everything. Connor leaned forward to tap the driver's shoulder, to get his attention, to ask what was happening. And his hand went through empty air. The driver's seat was vacant. No one was behind the wheel. But the car was still moving, the steering wheel turning smoothly on its own as they navigated a curve in the road. Connor's blood turned to ice, sobering him up faster than any amount of coffee could. "What the hell?" he whispered, his heart beginning to pound. He rubbed his eyes hard, convinced he was still drunk, still hallucinating, that this was some kind of alcohol-induced nightmare. But when he opened them again, the seat was still empty. And the car was accelerating, the speedometer climbing steadily. Panic surged through Connor's body like electricity. He lunged forward, trying to reach over the seat to grab the wheel, to take control, to stop whatever was happening. But his seatbelt locked tight, pinning him in place with mechanical efficiency. He fumbled with the buckle, his hands shaking violently, fingers slipping on the metal clasp. The car swerved suddenly, veering into the opposite lane before correcting itself with impossible precision. "Stop! Stop the car!" Connor screamed into the empty vehicle, but there was no one to hear him. He pounded on the windows with his fists, pulled desperately at the door handles. Locked. Everything was locked. He was trapped in a moving vehicle with no driver, no control, no way out. Connor's mind raced through possibilities, trying to make sense of the impossible. This had to be some kind of prank, right? Maybe it was a self-driving car and the driver had stepped into the back or hidden somehow as a joke. But when he checked the back seat beside him with frantic eyes, it was empty. He was completely alone. The speedometer climbed higher. 60, 65, 70 miles per hour. Connor's stomach lurched as the car barreled down the highway at increasing speed. He grabbed his phone with trembling hands, but it was dead, completely drained, the screen black and unresponsive. He couldn't call for help. He couldn't do anything but watch as the car drove itself deeper into the wilderness, taking him God knows where. But what happened next changed everything. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes of pure terror, Connor noticed something even more disturbing. The rearview mirror was angled toward him, as if someone, or something, was watching him from the front seat. And in the reflection, illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard lights, he swore he saw movement in the driver's seat. Not a person exactly, but a dark, shifting shadow that seemed to pulse and writhe like smoke, like it was breathing, like it was alive. Connor's entire body went rigid with primal terror, the kind of fear that comes from deep in the lizard brain. This isn't real. This isn't real, he repeated to himself, his voice barely a whisper, trying to convince himself this was still a drunken nightmare. The shadow seemed to respond to his fear, like it could sense his terror. The car accelerated even faster, the engine roaring as they flew down the highway at 80 miles per hour. Trees blurred past the windows. The white lines on the road became a solid streak. Connor squeezed his eyes shut, praying this was just a nightmare, that he'd wake up in his bed safe and sound with nothing worse than a hangover. But when he opened his eyes, nothing had changed. The car was still moving. The shadow was still there, darker now, more defined, more present. And then, without warning, the car began to slow. Connor watched in disbelief as the speedometer dropped. 80, 70, 60, 50, until finally, the car came to a complete stop on the side of the highway in the middle of nowhere. But what happened next changed everything. The door locks disengaged with a loud click that echoed in the silent car. Connor didn't wait. He didn't think. He threw the door open and stumbled out, his legs weak and unsteady from fear and residual alcohol. He fell to his knees on the gravel shoulder, gasping for air, his entire body shaking uncontrollably. When he looked back at the car with wide, terrified eyes, the driver's seat was still empty. But the engine was running, the headlights still on, illuminating the dark road ahead. Connor scrambled to his feet and ran as fast as his shaky legs would carry him, away from the car, away from whatever had been driving it, away from the impossible thing he'd just experienced. He flagged down a passing truck about a mile down the road, waving his arms frantically in the headlights. The driver, an older man hauling lumber, pulled over and helped Connor into the cab. "You all right, son? You look like you've seen a ghost." The man's weathered face was creased with concern. Connor couldn't speak. Words wouldn't come. He just pointed back toward where he'd come from, his hand trembling. The trucker called the police, and within an hour, officers arrived to investigate. They found the car exactly where Connor had left it, engine running, doors open, completely empty. But when they checked the dashcam footage, their faces went pale. They looked at each other with expressions Connor couldn't read. The footage showed Connor getting into the car at 1:32 a.m., clearly intoxicated. The driver, clearly visible in the footage, helped him into the back seat, buckled him in, confirmed his address. Everything appeared normal. But then, around 1:47 a.m., something bizarre happened. The driver seemed to flicker. Like a glitch in a video, like reality itself was stuttering. And then he was gone. Just gone. But the car kept driving. For the next 20 minutes, The dashcam showed the steering wheel turning on its own with smooth, deliberate movements, the gas pedal depressing without any foot on it. And in the driver's seat, barely visible but undeniably there, a dark, shadowy figure that moved and shifted like smoke, like something that existed between dimensions. But what happened next changed everything. Police traced the Uber account linked to the ride. The driver's profile belonged to a man named Robert Finch, a man who had died in a car accident on that exact stretch of highway 3 years earlier. He'd been driving an Uber passenger when another vehicle crossed the center line and hit them head-on. Both Robert and his passenger had been killed instantly. His account had been deactivated after his death, marked as inactive in the system. But somehow, impossibly, it had been reactivated the night Connor requested the ride. Uber had no explanation. The company's system showed no record of the trip, no payment processed, no data logged. It was as if the ride had never happened, as if Connor had hallucinated the entire thing. Connor never took another Uber again. He sold his car and started biking everywhere, too terrified to get into any vehicle he didn't control himself. The police closed the case as unexplained, and the dashcam footage was buried in evidence files, too disturbing and inexplicable to share publicly. But Connor knows what he experienced. He knows that someone, drove that car that night. And every time he passes that stretch of highway, which he avoids whenever possible, he feels a chill run down his spine. Because whatever was behind that wheel is still out there. Still driving, still picking up passengers who get in the wrong car at the wrong time. And Connor knows that some rides don't take you home. They take you somewhere else entirely. Somewhere you might never come back from. He was lucky. He escaped. But he knows others might not be so fortunate. And that knowledge haunts him every single day. Story 8. The Fake Uber. Samantha Cole realized too late that she'd made a fatal mistake. The car she'd climbed into wasn't her Uber. The license plate was wrong. The driver's face didn't match the app. And now, as he drove past her apartment building without slowing down, locking the doors with a cold smile, she understood with horrifying clarity that she might never make it home. But what happened next changed everything. It was a Saturday night in Columbia, South Carolina, and Samantha, a 21-year-old college student, had just finished a night out with friends in the 5 Points district. She was exhausted, slightly buzzed from the drinks she'd had, and ready to collapse into bed. The bar had been loud and crowded, her feet hurt from dancing, and all she wanted was to get home. She requested an Uber at 1:45 a.m. and waited outside the bar with a few other people, shivering in the cool night air. When a black Chevy Impala pulled up to the curb, Samantha barely glanced at it before opening the back door. She was tired, distracted, her judgment impaired by alcohol and exhaustion. "Uber for Samantha?" she asked. The driver nodded. That was all the confirmation she needed. That single nod sealed her fate. She climbed in, gave him a tired smile, and immediately pulled out her phone to text her roommate that she was on her way home. But as the car pulled away from the curb and merged into traffic, something nagged at the back of her mind. A small voice telling her something wasn't quite right. She glanced at her Uber app and her stomach dropped. It showed her driver, a man named Carlos, was still 3 minutes away, still approaching her location. Her blood ran cold as the realization crashed over her. She looked up at the driver with dawning horror. He wasn't Carlos. The profile photo showed a man in his 50s with gray hair and glasses. This driver was younger, maybe mid-30s, with dark hair and a cold, expressionless face that showed no emotion whatsoever. But what happened next changed everything. "Wait, are you Carlos?" Samantha asked, her voice shaking slightly with growing panic. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting hers with chilling calmness. "Yeah, that's me," he lied smoothly. But Samantha knew he was lying. The photo didn't match. The car didn't match. Nothing matched. Everything was wrong. Panic began to claw at her chest, making it hard to breathe. "Can you pull over? I think I got in the wrong car," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The driver didn't respond. Instead, he accelerated, blowing past a stop sign without even slowing down. "Hey, I said pull over!" Samantha yelled, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The driver reached over and hit the child lock button with deliberate slowness, trapping Samantha in the back seat. The click of the locks engaging sounded like a death sentence. "You're not getting out," he said calmly, his voice flat and emotionless, like he was discussing the weather. Samantha's entire body went cold. She tried the door handle desperately. Locked. She tried the window. It wouldn't roll down. She was trapped. "Let me out. Let me out right now," she screamed, pounding on the windows with her fists, hoping someone on the street would see, would help, would call police. But the driver ignored her screams completely, turning onto a dark side street away from the main road, away from witnesses, away from help. Samantha's mind raced as pure survival instinct kicked in. She had to do something. She grabbed her phone with trembling hands and tried to call 911, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely unlock the screen. Her fingers kept slipping, entering the wrong passcode. The driver glanced back at her, his expression hardening. "Put the phone down," he commanded. Samantha ignored him, her fingers finally managing to dial 911. But before the call could connect, the driver slammed on the brakes violently, throwing her forward against the front seat. Before she could recover, he reached back and tried to grab her phone, his hands grasping. Samantha fought back with everything she had, kicking at his arm, screaming at the top of her lungs for help. "Help! Somebody help me!" she shrieked, hoping someone, anyone, would hear. The driver cursed and grabbed her wrist brutally, his fingers digging into her skin. But Samantha twisted away with desperate strength, her survival instincts taking complete control. She noticed the driver's window was cracked open slightly, just enough. In a desperate move born of pure instinct, she threw her phone out the window, hoping someone would find it and call for help, hoping it would leave some trace of where she was. The phone clattered onto the pavement outside. The driver's face twisted with rage. "You stupid girl," he hissed, releasing her wrist. His anger was palpable, filling the car with violence. But what happened next changed everything. The driver pulled into an empty parking lot behind an abandoned warehouse, the kind of place where screams wouldn't be heard and bodies could be hidden. He put the car in park and turned to face Samantha, his eyes cold and predatory. "You should have just been quiet," he said, his voice low and menacing, promising terrible things. Samantha's heart hammered in her chest as he reached for the back door handle, preparing to come back there with her. But just as he was about to open it, bright headlights flooded the parking lot like divine intervention. A police car pulled in fast, sirens blaring, cutting through the night. The driver's face went white with shock. He threw the car into reverse, but it was too late. Officers jumped out, weapons drawn, surrounding the vehicle with tactical precision. "Get out of the car with your hands up," an officer shouted, his voice commanding and authoritative. The driver hesitated for a split second, his eyes darting between the officers and the exit, calculating his chances. Then he bolted from the car and ran, sprinting toward the darkness beyond the warehouse. But he didn't get far. Officers tackled him to the ground within seconds, their training taking over. Samantha sat in the back seat, shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down her face, her body racked with sobs of relief and terror. An officer opened her door carefully. "You're safe now. You're okay," he said gently. Samantha collapsed into the officer's arms, sobbing, unable to speak, unable to process that she'd survived. Police later explained what had saved her life. Samantha's phone, the one she'd thrown out the window in that moment of desperate clarity, had landed on a sidewalk near a late-night diner. A couple walking by after their own night out had found it, seen the frantic 911 call still active on the screen with the location showing, and immediately called police to report what they'd found. Officers had tracked the car using nearby traffic cameras, following its path through the city. They'd responded within minutes of getting the call, racing to intercept before it was too late. Samantha's quick thinking, that split-second decision to throw her phone, had saved her life. But what happened next changed everything. The driver, whose real name was Nathan Rowland, was arrested and charged with kidnapping, attempted assault, and a list of other crimes. Investigators later discovered he'd been impersonating Uber drivers for months, targeting young women leaving bars and clubs in Colombia and surrounding areas. He had a system. He'd watch for women who were alone, intoxicated, distracted. He'd use fake Uber stickers on his car and position himself near popular bars right when people were leaving. He'd already attacked 2 other women before Samantha. One had managed to escape by jumping from the moving vehicle, breaking her leg in the process. The other hadn't been so lucky. Her body had been found 2 weeks before Samantha's attack, but police hadn't connected the cases until now. Samantha's case broke the investigation wide open, providing the evidence needed to link Nathan to multiple crimes and leading to his conviction. The trial was long and emotionally exhausting. Samantha had to relive that night over and over, testifying in front of Nathan while he stared at her with cold, unrepentant eyes. But she stood strong, her voice never wavering as she told her story. The jury convicted him on all counts, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Samantha's story became a viral warning about the dangers of not verifying rideshare information. News outlets covered it extensively. She began speaking at college campuses across the country, urging students to always check the license plate, the driver's photo, and to never get into a car without confirming it's the right one. It only takes a second to check, she tells audiences, her voice firm and passionate. But that second could save your life. Check the license plate against your app every single time. Make the driver say your name before you get in. Share your location with friends. These simple steps seem paranoid until the moment they save your life. Samantha still takes Ubers when she needs to, refusing to let fear completely control her life. But she never, ever gets in without triple-checking everything. She makes the driver state her name. She verifies the license plate multiple times. She shares her location with 3 different people. Because she knows firsthand how close she came to becoming another statistic, another missing person poster, another family destroyed. And she refuses to let anyone else make the same mistake she did. Her vigilance is her armor now, and she wears it proudly, knowing that survival isn't just about luck. It's about being smart, being aware, and never assuming that the car that shows up is actually the one you ordered. Story 9. The Last Passenger. The text message haunted Linda Morris for months. It was the last thing her husband Greg had sent before he vanished. "One last ride, then I'm coming home." That was at 11:52 p.m. on a Thursday night. By Friday morning, Greg was gone. His taxi was found 4 days later, abandoned on a dirt road 50 miles outside Nashville. The seats were stained with blood. The driver's door was ajar, and Greg Morris was never seen again. But what happened next changed everything. Greg had been driving a taxi in Nashville for 12 years. He was 48 years old, a devoted husband and father of 2 teenage daughters, and known throughout the taxi company for his friendly demeanor and willingness to take late-night fares that other drivers avoided. He never complained about working until midnight or picking up passengers in sketchy neighborhoods. Thursday nights were always busy. Tourists exploring the honky-tonks on Broadway, bar hoppers moving between venues, late airport runs from business travelers. Greg usually worked until midnight, then headed home to his family in their suburban house. But that Thursday, he'd texted Linda saying he was taking one more fare, a pickup request from a hotel downtown that promised a big tip. Big tip, he'd written with enthusiasm. One last ride, then I'm coming home. Those words would replay in Linda's mind for years. Linda had smiled when she read the text, her heart warm with affection for her hard-working husband. Greg was always chasing one more fare, one more tip to save up for their daughter's college fund and the family vacation they'd been planning. She texted back, "Be safe. Love you." Greg never responded. At first, Linda didn't worry. Sometimes Greg's phone died during his shifts, or he got caught up in long conversations with chatty passengers who wanted to talk about Nashville's music scene. But when 2 a.m. rolled around and he still wasn't home, her worry deepened from concern to genuine fear. She tried calling, straight to voicemail every time. She tried texting, no response, no read receipts. By 4 a.m., Linda was full-blown panicking, pacing the living room. She called the police. But what happened next changed everything. Officers initially treated it as a routine late-night disappearance, suggesting Greg might have stopped for food or had car trouble somewhere without cell service. They tried to be reassuring, but Linda could see the doubt in their eyes. When they pinged his phone, it was off. Last location showing near downtown Nashville around midnight, right where he'd said he was picking up that final fare. They checked with the taxi company immediately. Greg's last logged fare was at 11:43 p.m., a drop-off at the airport, a businessman heading home after a conference. There was no record of another pickup after that. No GPS data showing movement, no dispatch call logged. It was as if Greg's one last ride had never officially existed in any system. Linda refused to give up on her husband. She plastered missing person flyers all over Nashville, on telephone poles, in coffee shops, on community bulletin boards, anywhere people might see. She contacted local news stations, begging them to cover the story. She organized search parties with friends and family, combing through areas where the taxi company's GPS had last pinged. Days turned into a week with no sign of Greg, no clues, nothing. Linda barely slept, barely ate, consumed by the need to find her husband. Then, on the 4th day, a hiker stumbled across Greg's taxi on a remote dirt road deep in the woods outside the city, miles from any main highway. The discovery would change everything, but not in the way Linda had desperately hoped. The car was empty when police arrived, the engine cold, having been there for days. But inside, the scene was horrifying and spoke of violence. The driver's seat was soaked with blood, so much blood that it had pooled on the floor mat and seeped into the carpet. There were signs of a vicious struggle. Deep scratches on the dashboard as if someone had clawed desperately for purchase. The rearview mirror cracked and hanging by wires, and blood smeared on the back window as if someone had tried to write something but didn't finish. Just a few streaks that looked like the beginning of letters before whoever made them either gave up or couldn't continue. The driver's side door was hanging open, and drag marks in the dirt suggested something, or someone, had been pulled from the vehicle into the dense forest. Police immediately launched a full investigation, treating it as a potential homicide. Forensic teams combed the vehicle for evidence, documenting every drop of blood, every fingerprint, every fiber. The blood was confirmed to be Greg's. His DNA was a match. But there were other traces, too, that made the case even more disturbing. DNA from an unknown individual that didn't match anyone in the criminal database, fingerprints that led nowhere, and something even more chilling: muddy footprints leading away from the car into the dense forest. The prints were large, suggesting a man, and deep, suggesting he was carrying something heavy. Search teams scoured the area for days, using cadaver dogs trained to detect human remains and helicopters equipped with thermal imaging. They found nothing. No body, no weapon, no clothing, no trace of Greg Morris anywhere. But what happened next changed everything. Detectives started digging into Greg's final hours with obsessive detail, following every lead, no matter how small. They reviewed traffic camera footage from downtown Nashville around the time Greg sent his last text. They found his taxi leaving a hotel at 11:54 p.m. with a passenger in the back seat, a figure obscured by shadows and the poor quality of the nighttime footage. The footage was grainy and old, the camera angles not ideal, but investigators could make out the silhouette of someone sitting behind Greg in the back seat. The taxi headed south, away from residential areas, toward the outskirts of the city where the woods began. That was the last confirmed sighting of Greg alive, the last time anyone saw him before he disappeared into the darkness. Investigators interviewed the hotel staff extensively, pressing for any detail that might help. They confirmed that around 11:50 p.m., a man had requested a taxi from the front desk. But the description was frustratingly vague. Middle-aged, average height, average build, wearing a dark jacket and baseball cap pulled low. Nothing distinctive or memorable. No one got a good look at his face because he'd kept his head down and spoken quietly. The man had paid cash for his hotel room and checked out immediately after calling for the taxi, not even staying the night despite having booked it. When investigators searched the room, it had been wiped clean with professional precision. No fingerprints on any surface, no personal items left behind, no DNA traces on the sheets or towels. It was as if he'd never been there at all. He was a ghost. The investigation hit wall after wall. The unknown DNA found in Greg's taxi didn't match any criminal databases locally or nationally. The fingerprints led nowhere. Security footage from surrounding businesses had either been deleted or didn't capture anything useful. Witnesses who might have seen something weren't coming forward, either because they hadn't noticed anything or because they didn't want to get involved. As weeks turned into months, the case grew cold despite the investigators' best efforts. Linda appeared on local news programs, her face haggard with grief and lack of sleep, begging for anyone with information to come forward. She offered a reward from their savings. She pleaded directly to whoever had taken her husband. But there was only silence. But what happened next changed everything. 6 months after Greg's disappearance, another taxi driver in Memphis, about 200 miles away, reported a similar incident. He'd picked up a passenger late at night who'd requested a ride to a remote location. The driver had gotten suspicious when the passenger started asking strange questions about whether anyone knew his route. He'd refused to continue and dropped the passenger off at a gas station. When that driver later heard about Greg's case through a regional taxi drivers association, he came forward with his story. His description of the passenger matched the vague details from Greg's last fare. Police began investigating whether there was a serial killer targeting taxi drivers across Tennessee. They found disturbing patterns in unsolved cases going back 5 years. At least 4 taxi or rideshare drivers had disappeared under similar circumstances in Tennessee and neighboring states. All taken their last ride of the night, all found abandoned in remote locations, all with signs of violence, but no bodies ever recovered. The killer was selecting his victims carefully, choosing drivers who worked late and alone, requesting rides to isolated areas where he could attack without witnesses. He paid cash, left no digital trail, and vanished into the night. Despite extensive investigations and multi-state task forces, he was never caught. The case remains open, but leads have dried up. Linda never got closure. She never got to bury her husband or say goodbye properly. Greg's taxi company started a scholarship fund in his name for drivers' children. His colleagues painted his cab number on their vehicles as a tribute. But for Linda and her daughters, there's only an empty chair at the dinner table and a text message that haunts them. One last ride, then I'm coming home. Greg never made it home. He drove off into the darkness with a passenger who had murder on his mind, and he never came back. Linda still keeps his phone number active, still sends him texts sometimes when the grief becomes too much. I love you. We miss you. Please come home. The messages never deliver. They just sit there in the void, waiting for a response that will never come. Because Greg Morris's last ride took him somewhere he couldn't return from. And somewhere out there, a killer is still riding in the back seats of taxis, still selecting his next victim, still leaving families destroyed in his wake. And until he's caught, every driver working late nights knows they could be next. Every last ride could truly be the last one they ever take. Story 10. Ghost Cab Rides. The receipt was still in Kenji Nakamura's hand when it vanished. One moment he was holding the paper slip the taxi driver had given him, proof of payment for the ride across Tokyo. And the next, it dissolved into nothing, like it had never existed at all. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was when Kenji looked up the address where the driver had picked him up and discovered it was the exact location where a young woman named Yuki Tanaka had died in a car accident 7 years earlier. She'd been a taxi driver, and according to dozens of reports, she was still giving rides. But what happened next changed everything. Kenji, a 35-year-old businessman in Tokyo, had been working late at his office in Shibuya on a rainy Tuesday night in October. It was past midnight when he finally left the building, exhausted from preparing for a major presentation. The streets were nearly empty, just the glow of neon signs reflecting off wet pavement and the distant sound of the last trains departing. He needed to get home to his apartment in Setagaya, about a 30-minute drive. He stepped to the curb and raised his hand to hail a taxi, a routine gesture he'd made thousands of times. A yellow cab pulled up almost immediately, as if it had been waiting for him specifically. The timing seemed fortuitous, almost too perfect. Kenji climbed into the back seat, grateful to be out of the cold rain. The driver was a young woman, which was unusual but not unheard of in Tokyo's taxi industry. She had long black hair tied back neatly and wore the standard taxi driver uniform. "Where to?" she asked politely, her voice soft and melodic. Kenji gave his address and settled into the seat, pulling out his phone to check emails. The drive was quiet, the only sound the rhythm of windshield wipers and the gentle hum of the engine. The driver took an unusual route. Side streets Kenji didn't recognize, but he didn't think much of it. Sometimes drivers avoided main roads to escape traffic, even late at night. But what happened next changed everything. As they approached his neighborhood, Kenji glanced up and noticed something odd about the driver in the rearview mirror. Her reflection seemed slightly off, almost translucent, like he could see through her to the seat behind. He blinked, assuming his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. When he looked again, she appeared normal. They arrived at his apartment building, and the driver turned to face him with a gentle smile. "That will be 4,800 yen, please." Kenji paid with exact change, and she handed him a receipt, a small paper slip with the fare amount, taxi number, and date printed on it. He thanked her and stepped out into the rain. By the time he reached his building's entrance and turned back, the taxi was gone, vanished. No tail lights disappearing down the street. Just gone. Kenji looked down at the receipt in his hand, intending to file it for his expense report. But as he watched in disbelief, the paper began to fade, becoming transparent and then disappearing entirely, dissolving into nothing like it was made of smoke. He stared at his empty palm, his heart beginning to race. That wasn't possible. Paper didn't just vanish. He must have dropped it. He searched the ground frantically, but there was nothing. The receipt was gone. Deeply unsettled, Kenji went inside and tried to sleep, but the image of that translucent reflection kept haunting him. The next morning, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been profoundly wrong about that ride. Kenji started researching online, searching for anything that might explain what happened. That's when he found the stories, dozens of them spanning years. Reports from passengers in Tokyo claiming to have taken taxi rides with drivers who seemed strange, ethereal, otherworldly. Passengers who paid fares and received receipts that vanished within minutes. The stories were eerily similar. Late-night rides, quiet female drivers, unusual routes, and payment slips that dissolved into nothing. But what happened next changed everything. Kenji found a forum dedicated to paranormal experiences in Tokyo. And there were at least 20 detailed accounts of people claiming to have been picked up by a ghost taxi driver named Yuki Tanaka. According to the stories, Yuki had been a 28-year-old taxi driver who loved her job despite the long hours and difficult passengers. She'd been driving for 5 years when tragedy struck. On a rainy October night 7 years ago, almost to the day of Kenji's experience, she'd been involved in a fatal accident. Another vehicle had run a red light and struck her taxi at an intersection in Shibuya. Yuki had died instantly. Her passenger, miraculously, had survived with minor injuries. But according to multiple reports since her death, Yuki's taxi had been seen continuing to pick up passengers late at night, always on rainy evenings, always near the intersection where she died. Kenji felt his blood run cold as he read the accounts. Several passengers described the same translucent reflection he'd seen. Others mentioned that the driver had taken strange, meandering routes that somehow still got them to their destinations. One person wrote that he'd tried to pay with a credit card, but the driver had insisted on cash, and when he'd looked at the receipt later, it had no taxi company name on it. Just blank spaces where the information should have been. Another passenger reported that she'd tried to look up the taxi number printed on her receipt, but no such number existed in any registry. The receipts always vanished within hours, leaving no proof the ride had ever happened. But what happened next changed everything. Kenji decided to visit the intersection where Yuki had died, driven by a need to understand what he'd experienced. When he arrived, he found a small memorial, flowers, incense, and a photograph of Yuki in her taxi driver uniform, smiling brightly. Local residents confirmed the story. An elderly shop owner nearby told Kenji that he'd seen Yuki's taxi multiple times over the years, always on rainy nights near midnight. "She's still working," the man said solemnly. "Some spirits don't know they've passed. They continue their routines, doing what they loved in life." Yuki loved being a taxi driver. She loved helping people get home safely. So she still does it, even now. Kenji learned that he wasn't alone in his experience. A woman named Hiromi Sato had written extensively about her encounter with Yuki's ghost taxi 3 years earlier. Hiromi had been caught in a rainstorm without an umbrella when a taxi had pulled up. The driver was kind and chatty, asking about Hiromi's day. But when Hiromi had gotten home and looked at the receipt, she'd noticed the date was wrong. It showed the date 7 years in the past, the exact date of Yuki's death. Within an hour, the receipt had crumbled to dust in her hands. Hiromi had researched the taxi number and discovered it belonged to a vehicle that had been destroyed in an accident years ago. Yuki's taxi. The stories weren't limited to Tokyo. Similar accounts came from New Orleans, where passengers reported taking late-night cab rides with drivers who seemed to exist in a different time period. One man in New Orleans described being picked up by a taxi driver who spoke in dated slang and seemed confused by the modern buildings. When they reached his destination, the driver had accepted payment and given him a receipt. But the receipt showed an address for a taxi company that had gone out of business in 1985. The man tried to research the driver's name printed on the receipt and discovered he'd been a cab driver who died in Hurricane Katrina. Yet passengers continued to report seeing his cab, always during storms, always near the areas most affected by the hurricane. But what happened next changed everything. Kenji became fascinated by these accounts and started documenting them systematically, creating a database of ghost taxi sightings across the world. He found patterns that were impossible to ignore. The encounters always happened late at night, usually during weather events like rain or fog. The drivers were always polite and professional, never threatening or malicious. They took passengers safely to their destinations, never causing harm. The receipts always vanished, leaving no trace. And when passengers researched the drivers, they invariably discovered they'd been real people who died while working as taxi or rideshare drivers. Psychologists and paranormal researchers had different theories. Some believed these were residual hauntings, echoes of people so dedicated to their work that their spirits continued the routine even after death. Others thought passengers were experiencing shared hallucinations triggered by exhaustion and the liminal space of late-night travel. Skeptics dismissed the stories entirely, claiming the vanishing receipts were simple paper that deteriorated quickly, or that passengers had simply lost them and fabricated the supernatural elements. But believers pointed to the consistency of the accounts across cultures and continents. How could so many people describe identical experiences if there wasn't some truth to it? Kenji never took another late-night taxi without carefully checking the driver's credentials first. He'd look at their license, verify the taxi number against registered companies, and always pay with a credit card to ensure a digital record. But he never encountered Yuki's ghost taxi again. Sometimes, on rainy October nights when he's working late, he'll look out his office window and scan the streets below, half expecting to see that yellow cab pulling up. Part of him wants to experience it again, to confirm it was real and not some exhaustion-induced hallucination. But another part of him hopes he never sees that translucent reflection again. The phenomenon continues to this day. Every year, new reports emerge of ghost taxi rides in cities around the world. In Tokyo, the Yuki Tanaka Memorial at that Shibuya intersection continues to receive fresh flowers from grateful passengers who believe she safely guided them home. In New Orleans, tours have started, including the alleged routes of ghost cabs. Though guides are careful to note these are folklore rather than confirmed fact. But for those who've experienced it, who've sat in that back seat, received that receipt, and watched it vanish, there's no doubt. Some drivers are so dedicated to their work, so committed to getting people home safely, that not even death can make them abandon their routes. And on rainy nights in cities across the world, If you're standing alone on a corner trying to hail a ride, and a taxi pulls up that seems just a little too perfect in its timing, pay attention. Look at the driver's reflection. Check the receipt carefully before it dissolves in your hands, because you might have just experienced something that exists in the space between this world and the next. A ghost cab ride with a driver who refused to let death be the end of their final shift. These spirits aren't trying to scare anyone. They're just doing what they loved most, making sure people get home safely. And maybe that's the most beautiful kind of haunting there is.